Okay, welcome everyone. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je m'appelle Natasha Barth et je suis professeure à la faculté de droit. J'aimerais vous souhaiter bienvenue à cet événement sponsorisé par la chaire Greenberg. Avant de commencer, je veux reconnaître que l'Université d'Ottawa est située sur le territoire non cédé des peuples algonquins. Many of us are uninvited guests here, and I know that I am grateful to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. Our recognition and acknowledgement of traditional Algonquin territory is a small step toward our ongoing efforts at reconciliation. So I say this land acknowledgement in the hopes that we will take very seriously its many implications in each of our daily lives. I'm so pleased to be introducing our guest speaker today. Rabiat Akande is an assistant professor at Osgoode Law School. Professor Akande's work explores struggles over religion-state relations in comparative contexts, and it illuminates law's centrality to one of modernity's most contested issues, the relationship between religion, the state, and society. Professor Akande's work also interrogates law's complex relationship with power, political theology, identity, and socio-political change. And these issues are actually at the forefront of her book entitled Entangled Domains, Empire, Law, and Religion in Northern Nigeria. And this is a book that came out in 2023 by Cambridge University Press. And the book traces the emergence of secularism as a constitutional idea of ordering religion-state relations in early to mid-20th century British colonial northern Nigeria. I invited Professor Akande to speak with us for a number of reasons, but I was so impressed in particular with a chapter she wrote in a book called Systemic Islamophobia in Canada. And I know some of my students are here and you've read this article where she talked about centering the Black Muslima, and she interrogated gendered anti-Black Islamophobia. Today, she's talking about something a little bit different. The title of her presentation is Beyond Intersectionality, Toward a Race-Religion Construction of Gendered Islamophobia. Please welcome Professor Akande. Just want to check everyone online can hear us.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Good. Awesome. Thank you so much, Professor Barth, for this really kind invitation. It's an incredible honor to be here, and I love Ottawa. It's my first time, but I love it already. So really excited to share some thoughts with you all and to have us all have a back and forth engagement at the end. If at any time you can't hear me clearly or I speak too quickly, which I sometimes do when I get very excited, just let me know. Okay, good. All right. So my remarks for the next 45, 50 minutes will take as its entry point a specific international legal debate that is currently unfolding over what an appropriate international legal response to Islamophobia ought to look like. That debate has arisen from a proposal at the United Nations to extend the provisions of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. It's called the ICED. It's a marker. Is there like a marker? Something? Just have it on the board. So again, it's the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. ICED. So I'll say ICED a lot in this talk because I'm sure you don't want to hear me all keep repeating that mouthful. So that proposal wants to center this convention, which is the foremost UN, really the international legal instrument that deals with the question of racial discrimination to cases of religious discrimination. Right, so let's have this framework governing racial discrimination, again, extend to cases or at least certain cases of religious discrimination. And so the idea is that, well, the international community ought to formulate a protocol, right, as an addendum to the existing convention. So that proposal has not been limited to a particular form of religion. There have been a couple of religious experiences and examples that have been centered in those debates. But the question of Islamophobia has come up over and over again. And I think it would be fairly accurate to say that much more than any other experience, the experience of Islamophobia has really, been, in many ways central to the debate, although the debate has not by any means been exclusively focused on Muslims. So it's impossible, I would say to date, to deny that Islamophobia, which I describe here as anti-Muslim othering or discrimination, is the pervasive problem today. So studies upon studies have underscored the seriousness of that problem as a social, political, and legal phenomenon here in North America, across Europe, in Asia, and indeed globally. And although my talk will, in fact, make references to local contexts, I am going to leverage my own expertise as a global legal historian, one who focuses on colonial and post-colonial contexts, to zoom in on the global and international dimensions of Islamophobia. And so the goal is to use the ongoing UN debates as a way to historicize, to analyze, and to theorize an appropriate international legal response to Islamophobia, and in particular to gendered Islamophobia. So quick disclosure, I've been involved in the UN discussions myself, because I was invited to provide expert advice to the state parties to the negotiations. But of course, these remarks are not commissioned by, the United Nations or by any of the state parties. I also, as I want to move on, really want to quickly flesh out the sides to the ongoing UN debate to give you a sense of what, what that discussion looks like and who is on what side and what sort of arguments one hears about this proposal. The proposal to extend ICERD again to cases of religious discrimination is being supported by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, so predominantly Muslim states, as well by states who belong to the Africa group, right? So the African states, but it also enjoys widespread support among several Asian states, and indeed from much of the formerly colonized world. Right, so notice that what unites these proponents of this idea is the history and memory of colonialism, of European colonialism in particular. And we're going to see why that's important as I continue with my talk. These proponents argue that not Euro-Christian groups, right, religious groups outside of Euro-America, experience discrimination at the intersection of race and religion. They also argue that, in fact, the extension of ICERD to religious discrimination is important precisely because a protection gap currently exists within the international legal framework. So what do they mean by this? They argue that, well, for many religious groups, so often they would call these racialized religious groups, again, the experiences of Muslims have come up over and over again, that for these groups, whose religious faiths, right, are not traditionally associated with Europe, that when they seek international legal protection for the experience of discrimination, they turn to the international legal framework on religious liberty, but usually find no recourse, right? So they usually don't, are unable to get, their claims resolved by invoking the international law of religious liberty. But these groups also are typically unable to get these, problems resolved simply by turning to the international legal framework on racial, that prohibits racial discrimination. So they go to religious liberty, they don't find a recourse. They go to racial discrimination, they don't find a recourse as well. And so there is a protection gap, they would argue. And so notice again the language of that claim, right? That the issue is in fact that the current international legal framework does not, it has failed to adopt an intersectionalized approach, right, to dealing with the problem of racial and religious discrimination. And so the argument by this proponent is that, well, there is a lack of intersectionality, or there's a lack of attunement to intersectionality within the current international legal framework. What is paradoxical, in fact, is that much of the opposition to that proposal itself is on the ground of intersectionality, right? So those who oppose the proposal argue that actually to extend ICER's protection to religious discrimination would be to unduly bolster religious identity. These critics worry about the question of intra-group vulnerability, right? So they argue that, well, oppression is a real thing. Islamophobia is a real thing, for instance, but that oppression is not evenly distributed, right, within the ranks of marginalized groups. And so the concern that has been expressed by these critics, foremost of which has been the European Union, is that, well, if one were to extend ICER protections to religious discrimination, then one might actually, be obscuring, and certainly be failing to respond to the experience of internal minorities. So think, for instance, of Muslim women. Right. So if we protected Islamophobia as a racial, or under the ground of race, then somehow we will be masking the marginalization of Muslim women. But other internal minorities have also been invoked. All right. So that debate is currently unfolding on the UN, but this question, right, this question of what an appropriate international legal response ought to be has not at all been limited to the UN. And these, consistent invocation of intersectionality has been what is lacking, has been very much present in the debates even beyond the UN. My remarks will draw on the history of the European colonial encounter, specifically with Africa and the Muslim world to intervene in this ongoing debate. I'm going to make three arguments. First, I will argue that contrary to popular assertions, including on both sides of the UN debates that I've described, racial and religious othering and discrimination, especially as it manifests in Islamophobia, were mutually co-constitutive rather than merely intersectional in the colonial encounter that was foundational to the making of international law. And so that conclusion leads me to borrow the term race religion from Geraldine Heng to term that mutual co-constitution of racial and religious othering as race religion othering. Second, I am going to attempt to show that the contemporary proposal to rethink international legal protections to racial and religious discrimination by interlinking them is not as unique as one might actually imagine it is from listening to the ongoing debates, but that actually that proposal has risen twice in international legal history, and that understanding those past efforts is crucial to apprehending what I call the international legal politics of race, religion, othering. Third, I argue that the legacy of that history that I would trace lives on in the enduring international legal problem of race, religion, discrimination that is both heightened and pervasive in Islamophobia. I also suggest that well-meaning attempts to respond to that problem by invoking intersectionality actually obscures more than it reveals. What is crucial, I would suggest, to responding to Islamophobia is an analysis that is grounded in a history-informed theory of race, religion, discrimination. And so I will map out my, my talks along those lines. So first, lay out the history of race, religion, othering in the colonial encounter. Second, I will highlight past attempts to respond to that problem. And then third, I'm going to return to the present to analyze why that history is important, how it helps us to respond to Islamophobia and specifically to gendered Islamophobia. So, acknowledging the racial and religious hierarchy on which the modern law of nations, which is also international law, was founded, leading international legal jurist Francis Oppenheim declared, in 1905, that international law is in quote, essentially a product of a Christian civilization. That Christian civilizational identity that Oppenheim referenced was not only religious, it was also racial. Revealing the racial dimensions of that identity, John Westlake, professor of international law at Cambridge, famously noted in 1894 that, quote, the inflow of the white race cannot be stopped where there is land to cultivate. By setting a civilizational distinction between the Christian white race and the savage fanatical or the European empire and the international law it engendered, promoted an indivisible race-religion discourse. So I don't know how many of you have had a chance to take courses in international law, how familiar you are in particular with third-world approaches to international law. But for those who are, you would already have realized that this point that I'm making about the civilizational distinction is not new per se, because that body of scholarship already, has since argued that it was a civilizational differentiation between a civilized Europe and its uncivilized others that legitimated the making of modern international law as we now know it. Yet, an explication of the constituent elements of that civilizational distinction has been lacking from those accounts. What I do is to situate a race-religion authoring at the heart of that civilizational dichotomy. So that race-religion discourse that I described was apparent at the conference that was convened from 1884 to 86 in Berlin to parcel out African territories among European powers. The Berlin processes were founded on the premise of the superiority of the idea of Western Christian civilization, and delegates were firmly convinced of the close connection between Western culture and Christianity. For them, the absolute cultural superiority of the Christian West was not a matter of debate. In fact, to understand who the African was in relation to the European was to appreciate how the African's race was constitutive of her religion in imperial discourse. Many delegates at Berlin embraced the theological understanding that Blacks had inherited as curse from their alleged ancestral harm, which had led, in fact, to a divine chastisement for Africa. So these were the scriptural references that tended to be made during the Berlin discussions. And so the colonial venture itself was really a response to light those living in darkness. Again, to make another scriptural reference that was often made during those discussions. That Christian civilizational project and the discourse that it produced served to unite participants at Berlin, even as rivalry between European states and different Christian confessions simmered in the background. The project that I described also found expression in law. So consider, for instance, Article 6 of the Berlin General Act, which was the legal instrument that was produced by the Berlin Conference. By Article 6, European powers committed to instruct the natives and bring home to them the blessings of civilization. By legal definition, the native referenced in Article 6 was non-white, was African and non-Christian, always necessarily an other to the European. The vehicle for that civilizational project was the mission to Christianize Africans on European terms. Yet the mutual co-constitution of race and religion in that project made that Christianizing goal impossible, right, from its inception. And so, for instance, early Pan-Africanist thinkers like E.W. Blyden noted that Africans could not truly become Christians, right, as much as European missionaries wanted them to be, because to be Christian in that paradigm was to be both European and Christian. In fact, some colonial, and specifically some British colonial officials expressed misgivings about missionary activities among Africans. One prominent example was the first colonial governor of northern Nigeria, which was a predominantly Muslim territory, and the place that I focus on in my recent book. Frederick Lugard argued that, in fact, Africans were better off being left as Muslims. In his words, Islam is incapable of the highest development, but its limitations suit the limitations of the people, right? So that, well, in its paradigm, Christianity was the peak of civilization, but Africans just did not have the capacity to become Christians. So, better that they be left as Muslims, in fact. And so this meant that, in fact, yes, the native was an other to the European, but there was some differentiation between the natives themselves. There were, if you will, degrees of othering. In fact, Islam was regarded as the quintessential other, leading Muslim African societies to be of primacy to the imperial project. So one historian, Thomas Prush, puts it this way. So he says, well, for the late Victorian missionary enterprise, Islam represented the quintessential other, the faith that was most resistant, most competitive. And for Victorians, Africa was the obvious arena of contention, the blankest continent on the imperial map. And so rather than severing this link that I'm trying to trace between race and religion in the native, the non-European other, these differentiations between colonized native populations actually show that there were degrees of precarity, right? While also underscoring the centrality of this race-religion othering, right, to the colonial project. So I just gave the example of northern Nigeria. Let's go to French colonial Algeria, right? In which so this was the site in which the French actually pursued an unveiling project, right? A project to unveil Muslim women, as they call it. So some might read that French unveiling project as a secular endeavor, right? That France was only pursuing secularism, and that secularism was in fact informed by a post-French Revolution aversion to religion, right, including the church. And so in that reading, that secularist reading of what the French were doing in colonial Algeria, the unveiling project was actually racial, right? It was the antithesis of a religious endeavor. So it might be sort of the counterexample to the story that I'm trying to tell. But in fact, that agenda, I argue, was at once racial as it was religious. Indeed, the image of the veiled Muslim woman, right, the woman who the French were trying to unveil in Algeria was a racialized one, functioning as what Ali Assaji describes as the negative mirror in which Western constructions of identity and gender would be positively reflected. The French colonial gaze projected gender oppression onto Islam and naturalized that oppression onto the bodies of Muslim women, effectively racializing the veil and Muslims. But that project was not just racial, right? So race was, yes, part of the story, but it was also a project of religious othering. Crucially, even as the French colonizer abandoned justifications of laicity, the project was not neutral of religion. In fact, the so-called secular public space that required unveiling contradicted only some religions, mainly Islam, and not others, with the consequence that it functioned to preclude only the racial other's religious expression. So historians, have made much of the differences between the colonial approaches of the British and the French, which are the two examples that I've put on the table. And, these were after all, two great imperial powers of the 19th century. So there's been much talk about how they had different approaches in their colonies outside of the New World, and particularly in Africa. So one, dominant narrative goes like this, right? That while the British were committed to preserving, native religious institutions, right? So think, for example, of the quote that I had from the Nigerian governor, Lugard, right, saying, better leave Africans as Muslims, right? The British were just convinced to keeping, their colonized populations, in their native forms of religion, including, for instance, Islam. And that's so the British mode would be essentially to say, well, it's a good thing for Muslim women to remain to remain veiled, right? Better for you to remain Muslims because you can't possibly become Christian. right? So that's one understanding of like, well, this is what the Brits were doing. And then, well, the argument is, well, the French were the complete opposite, right? That for the French, in fact, they sought to make French men, women of their colonized populations, right? And in that reading, the French approach would be very similar to what Christian missionaries were doing. So the point of this juxtaposition is to highlight how that narrative understands the imperial project has been different, right? Again, it would be a counter narrative to the story that I'm trying to portray, that all the colonial projects, all imperial projects were based on a race-religion distinction. So that juxtaposition might appear, right, to paint a picture, right, of different imperial projects, but in fact, both proceeded from a notion of racial and religious hierarchy and of racial and religious subordination. And so, for instance, for administrators in British Africa, like Lugard, the racial inferiority of the African and of Muslims translated into the impossibility of their conversion to Christianity, right? So they can't possibly, become Christian. They just don't have the, the inherent capacity to become Christian. But that notion of racial and religious inferiority also undergirded the French approach to empire and indeed to Christian missionary efforts. The call for conversion, either to become French or to become Christian, was itself based on a conviction that Muslims and Africans required a form of civilization that only the European and American missionary enterprise could provide. And so in both the French, and the British approaches to empire, race and religion were interdependent, right? So race religion was always, I argue, foundational to the colonial encounter, to the colonial construction of what the other was, and it legitimated ideas about, what was lawful, about legitimated ideas of relations between nations. It was foundational, I argue, to the making of modern international law. So it's also really important to underscore here that although those international legal engagements produce, for instance, provisions such as religious liberty provisions within the Berlin General Act. I referred to the Berlin Act earlier. That religious liberty was in fact impossible for everyone, right? So in theory, like if one looked back at the archives and looked at these legal instruments, one would see that religious liberty was in the books, right? And the proclamation of religious liberty extended to everyone. But in fact, because race and religion were co-constitutive, because racial and religious othering were mutually co-constitutive, religious liberty could not actually be afforded colonized populations, right? Because they were not merely seen as religious, they were always racial and religious others. So of course, I've provided examples from from Africa, from Muslim societies, but as that story of race, religion, hierarchy legitimated imperial rule in Africa, so too did it unfold globally, including here in North America, the European construction and legal treatment of indigenous populations. And I devote some attention to that in a recent article that I would be happy to discuss during our discussion. But I want to move on quickly to paint a picture of how colonized populations responded to this hierarchy, right, to this form of subordination. So there were two attempts that I've found, two international legal attempts to confront that project. The first that I documented was by Japan in the earlier decades of the 20th century. But I'm going to, instead of focusing on the Japanese response, which I would be happy to discuss, I want to instead move to the second attempt, which came after the Second World War, because it's that second attempt that actually produced the ICERD as we now know it. Right? So it's more central to the story that I'm trying to tell here. So following a series of horrifying anti-Semitic incidents, including the desecration of Jewish graveyards across Europe in the 1950s, there were fears of the resurgence of Nazism. And in response, the United Nations debated a proposal for an international convention that would address the problem of racial and religious discrimination as interlinked challenges. That proposal was actually championed by African states, states from the Middle East, states in Asia, states that in essence had just emerged from colonialism, right? So they had experienced this form of race-religious subordination. They understood that, it was not productive to think about religious othering and racial othering as distinct challenges, because they understood that both were mutually co-constitutive, and that's how colonialism was legitimated in international law, and that was the foundations of modern international law. So I'm going to move to what defeated that proposal in spite of the widespread support that it enjoyed among states who had recently been at least formally decolonized. And I want to underscore that the discussions, the tensions, the dynamics that defeated that proposal, because it underscores what I call the international politics of racing religion, or race religion argument. So that proposal was doomed in the end by Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. The US-Soviet debate over that proposal to interlink racial and religious protections centered over whether the problem was racial discrimination or whether the problem was religious discrimination. And so the US argued over and over again at the UN that actually the primary international legal problem of the time was religious discrimination. Right? Religious discrimination is the problem, the US argued. They also argued that actually that problem manifested primarily in anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union at the time. Right? And so they said, well, why focus on racial discrimination? Let's think about religious discrimination, because we see that this is a problem. We see it in anti-Semitism. The Soviet Union argued that actually the problem was not religious discrimination. The true problem of the time was racial discrimination. The Soviet representatives in the UN, would point to events in the US, right? They say, well, look at the United States. The whole world is privy to what's unfolding in the, in the UN. So in the US, so again, this was in the late 50s, 60s. This was unfolding. That discussion was unfolding in the years following the US Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education, right? The decision in which the US Supreme Court ordered the desegregation of schools, right? And as some of you might know, probably all of you know, there was intense opposition to the enforcement of that decision, right? So it was of global knowledge. The Soviets would argue at the UN that actually just look at the US, racial discrimination is the true evil. That's what the UN ought to be focusing on. So notice that although the US and the Soviet, were opposing each other, they were agreed on one thing. And that was that those two issues had to be delinked, right? That it was that the problem of racial discrimination and the problem of religious discrimination ought to be delinked. They're two separate things. Let's not think about them in the same way, although, of course, they disagreed over which one was the problem. That's true. So eventually, it's a long story. Again, happy to think about it during the discussion. But the proposal was to interlink the issue of racial and religious discrimination. Eventually, failed under the weight of that disagreement between the US, and the Soviet Union. Ultimately, it was agreed that the UN would then consider those two issues separately in different conventions. The convention regarding religious discrimination never, in fact, materialized for reasons, again, that I would be happy to talk about. But the ICERD came into existence in 1965, right? So they isolated those two. They delinked the two problems, addressed race in ICERD. The religious question does not actually come to be addressed in a convention. Okay, I've spoken a lot. To move on, I'm just going to move to the present, right? So why does this story matter at all to the present? Is this history past? How is it relevant to how we or to think about Islamophobia today as an international legal problem? How might it be useful to how we ought to think about addressing Islamophobia? The international legal history of race, religion, authoring is actually far from past. It lives on, I would argue, in both the authoring of Europe's paradigmatic order, the Muslim, and in the protection gap that continues to preclude an international legal response to the problem of race, religion, authoring. Today, the broader social and political conditions for othering Muslims reveal a homogenization of Muslims and an attribution of racial markers to Muslims, in spite of Muslims being, of course, culturally, nationally, and ethnically diverse. So the world is experiencing what UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, Ahmed Shahid, has described as epidemic levels of anti-Muslim hatred. Right, in fact, that we see demonstrated globally, transnationally and locally. Not a few scholars continue to grapple with what they see as the incongruence of international laws about commitment to religious liberty, right? So I know that earlier that the Convention on Racial, but it did not materialize, but there are, international legal instruments that think about the question of religion in different ways. So, there are UN declarations. It's one might say it's also a question of customary international law. There are provisions in it enjoys attention in as a separate as a distinct provision in different UN instruments, although it's not actually the subject of a convention devoted to it as race is in ICERD, right? And so, in theory, if one wanted to invoke religious liberty for an international court, you could certainly make reference to if you read international legal instruments, right? So scholars, scholars of religious liberty often grapple, right, with this incongruence between incongruity between international law's commitment to religious liberty in theory, right, that is ostensibly available to everyone on the one hand, and what they see over and over again has been the absence of effectual international legal response to the problem of Islamophobia. So one manifestation of that dichotomy that has been of particular interest to scholars has been the case of restrictions on Muslim women's clothing, right? So, as is seen, across Europe, we've seen it in Canada, and in the repeated failure of headscarf wearers to secure protections when they appeal to international law, right? So obviously, what I described as clothing or headscarf, it's really varied. It includes, the hijab, the niqab, and I mean, we have the expert in the room. It's not all the same thing, but I describe it, simply as the headscarf, right? So to make the theoretical point that I'm trying to make, not to, obscure the distinctions in those forms of clothing or the distinctions, in fact, in the sort of laws and regulations that have been targeting them. To show this dichotomy in international law's commitment to religious freedom on the one hand, and the situation of Muslim scholars have often cited to decisions of the European Court of Human Rights, right, that appear to be at odds. So the first is the court's 2001 decision in Dahlab, Switzerland, in which, some of you in Professor Bach's class might have already read that case. Okay, haven't you? So, to describe that decision really, really briefly and simplistically, the European Court of Human Rights held in that case that a Swiss public elementary school teacher who had converted to Islam and wanted to and began to wear the headscarf could not enjoy international legal protections to do so, because to do so would actually violate the state's policy of what the court described as interdenominational neutrality, so of secularism. To explain that really simplistically. Right. And so the idea was that, well, religious liberty exists, but this would be a derogable exercise of religious liberty. Like this would be, if you will, an exception. Yet in another case, in Lauzi v. Italy, the same court upheld the presence of crucifixes in Italian schools, holding that crucifixes are in fact evidence of Europe's Christian culture and history, right? So it's not religious, it's sort of cultural, it's historical, the court says. So scholars have been confounded by these seeming inconsistencies. So Dahlab and Lauzi are just two examples of what has been, really a long, and really rich body of literature thinking about these questions. So, one prominent response to this has been provided by critical theorists of secularism, right, led by Talal Assad, who, have drawn our attention to the sort of technologies of rule that are at play when apparently secular states and courts curtail or prescribe the wearing of, of the headscarf, even while those states and courts create conditions that allow for the thriving, of religious symbols, right, that are associated with other religious traditions. And so these scholars argue that the state is in fact exercising its sovereign power to define what religion is, right, as a prelude to then drawing a line that separates religion, right, which the state is itself defining, right, and specifically what forms of religion are tolerable from a secular that it's also been defined by the state, right? So the state is both drawing the line and it's claiming, that line drawing is neutral, although both spheres are in fact being, defined by the state through its sovereign prerogative. And so in essence, these works draw our attention to the politics of states' selective commitment to religious liberty. The history that I've offered goes further. I argue that an appreciation of the interplay between racial and religious othering eliminates what first appears to be an unprincipled construction of the sacred and the secular. The court's conception of what religion is and what it is not, of what forms of religion are worthy of protection and of what forms of religion are not worthy of protection, is intimately linked with the process of racial construction that is integral to a civilizational distinction that is at the same time racial as it religious. Bound in that civilizational distinction, the simultaneous racial and religious othering finds life in the gender discourse that the court and both the court, and states with ethical restrictions deploy. So consider, for instance, the European Court of Human Rights Declaration in Dahlab, that the headscarf code appears to be imposed on women by a precept that is laid down in the Quran and which is hard to square with the principle of gender equality. Such rhetoric finds life beyond the European Court of Human Rights and today's Euro-America, eliciting, for instance, the colonial legacy in French Algeria. So as scholars like Ali Assaji argues, and I referred to Ali Assaji earlier, that discourse functions as a way of racializing Muslims by projecting gender oppression onto Islam and by naturalizing that gender oppression onto Islam. And by so doing, it in fact, the discourse that is defines Christian Europe as the very opposite of the veil. So notice how that mirroring process homogenizes Muslims in particular and Muslim women, Muslims in general, and Muslim women in particular. And so the legacy of the history that I tell is that claimants like Dahlab would fail if they appealed to religious liberty protections, but Ms. Dahlab, the white Swiss convert, would also fail were she to have invoked the contemporary international legal framework on racial discrimination, right? So if she had appealed to ICED, she would have also failed. And that protection gap, right, that through which she's slipping, right? She can't get protections under religious liberty. She can't get protections under the framework on race. That gap through which she's falling through is a product of the history that I tell today, right? So it's a product of the colonial foundations, right? The race, religion, authoring that is at the heart of empire But it's also a product of the US Soviet Union delinking of racial and religious discrimination that I described as well. Now, in fact, as the ISRD is currently being expounded upon in jurisprudence, it's been understood, race continues to be understood in somatic terms, right? So if you do like, gender, biology or skin color, right? So that's how race continues to be expounded in the law, right? For all the advances, right? So we speak in public discourse, in much better terms, but actually like when one reads carefully what the jurisprudence is, then one sees that skin color continues to over and over again, play a central role in understandings of race. So that construction of racial discrimination would not accommodate Ms. Dahlab, the white Swiss Muslim convert. But what's also really interesting is that understanding of racial discrimination would also not be responsive to the problem of Black or brown women. So phenotypically Black or brown women would bring claims for racial discrimination for the headscarf, for the headscarf as such, right? So white Muslim women won't get protection, they will fall through a protection gap because it's, they won't get protection on that religious liberty, won't get protection on that racial equality. But Black or brown women also can't bring claims for the headscarf as a racial discrimination claim, right? So they are also falling through a protection gap. What's also really interesting is that what's sustaining this protection gap is actually a well-intended legal response that understands Islamophobia as solely an intersectional problem of race and religious discrimination. So what do I mean by this? I'm going to shed light on this by going to the jurisprudence of the CERT, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So that's the body, that's the UN body to which you essentially go to, right, if you wanted to bring ISRD claims. So let's think, for instance, about a case. It's called Communication in Cert Parlance, a 2006 case, which is still reflective of the state of the law, in which the petitioner argued that Islamophobia has been expressed as a form of racism after 9/11. So that's what the petitioner was arguing. The CERT found that it didn't have jurisdiction to address that case and said, well, it was inadmissible. What's really interesting was that the CERT in that case invoked the language of intersectionality, right, as a way to construe what's going on in Islamophobia. So the CERT said, well, yes, there is an interface, and now I'm quoting CERT. The CERT acknowledged in court the importance of the interface between race and religion, and went for that to say that, well, CERT was competent to address claims of double discrimination based on race and religion. So the CERT is understanding those two categories as being distinct. One is religion, one is race. When they interlink, when they intersect in that understanding, then you can bring it to us. The CERT is also saying, well, as the fact of that case was being presented, this was just religion, right? It's not a claim of double discrimination. So what I argue is that understanding of racial and religious othering is ahistorical. The understanding of racial and religious othering has been distinct. The question of racial othering and religious othering has been distinct forms of othering that intersect, right? And the court has to see two forms of othering clearly, right? The committee, the CERT has to see two forms of discrimination double, right? One race, one religion, and then when intersect, bring it to us. That understanding actually is one that does not account for the history that I tell today. The language of intersectionality, and specifically of understanding intersectionality as double discrimination based on the separate identities of race and religion, continues, however, to be the language in which both the UN debates that I described earlier at the beginning of my talk and contemporary juristic attempt, in fact, progressive juristic attempts to confront the problem is being conducted. that approach, again, to underscore my point, fails to account for the mutual co-constitution of racial and religious othering, right, in both the history and I would argue the present of international law. And now I'm going to move to conclude. The history that I have laid out suggests that the language of intersectionality actually obscures more than it reveals in understanding race, religion, othering. So there is no doubt that intersectionality has much to offer in unmasking intra-group forms of vulnerability, right? So vulnerability of, the heightened vulnerability, for instance, of Muslim women, right? And I've thought about that in the chapter that Professor Bacht referenced in the introduction. And so, yes, it is true that oppression is not evenly distributed, for sure, yet that uneven distribution of oppression does not undo the enduring historical structuration of the race-religion distinction. Instead, to understand the international legal problem of race-religion discrimination and to begin to imagine an effectual international legal response is to first be attuned to the mutual co-constitution of racial and religious othering in the imperial history and present of international law. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor Akande. You accomplished so much in terms of taking us through this really rich history and very interesting narrative and really take it to your thesis. So let me open it up to discussions. Does anyone have a question that they would like to ask? Chat here. Okay, we've got a couple of questions. Yeah, just go ahead.
Yes, I have a question. When you were speaking about the historical oppression imposed with this in colonial times, and the role of the state of sort of like religious oppression as well. I was curious about what the role of the church was in that, and sort of if they were an active participant in that, and if so, how like, I guess they were not active participants in that. How have they been sort of what's the word? Well, not held responsible, but like what when you talk about the UN and the nations that are brought to the conversation of the discrimination that occurred, how's the what role has the in that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much. Beatrice?
Beatrice,
Yes. Thank you so much. I mean, so that's a really interesting question, and one of the questions that make doing walks on imperial history, even more challenging. Right? So, for sure, as I laid out in the beginning, to understand the foundations of the imperial project is to understand, this race-religion framing, right? That was the product of really a meeting of minds between European state and Christian missionaries, right? So I describe the Berlin processes, right, and the sorts of discussions that the invocations of the biblical references that legitimated, right, the colonial enterprise. And so yes, there was a meeting of minds, but it would also be a mistake to understand imperialism, right, through that single lens, because there were certainly tensions between colonial government, between European colonial administrators and Christian missionaries. And so, for instance, in my book, I tell the story of what that tension meant in British colonial Nigeria. In British, colonial, thought, what happened after the Indian Mutiny, in 1857. I should say mutiny, like rebellion, revolt, like depending on who you ask. But the idea was that, well, that rebellion by colonized populations against the imperial project was understood primarily by colonial officials, both in India and in England, as being a revolt to what they saw as the Christianizing ethos of empire, right? And so the idea was that, well, these Muslim subjects are revolting because they are resisting, this cooperation between colonial government and Christian missions. The one important response to that was this shift to then begin to govern colonized spaces through their indigenous institutions, including primarily through their religious institutions. That led, for instance, in a place like northern Nigeria, in which the colonial government then began to govern formal empire begins in northern Nigeria, in the early 1900s. The colonial government begins to govern through what remained of the pre-colonial caliphate, right? And so in theory, one might say, well, what's going on here? Like, why is the British government taking Islam seriously? Why is it governing through Muslim chiefs? That shift, the adoption of that approach is really, an outcome of that broader imperial shift within British spaces. So it's not French, this is British, post-1857. It also means in northern Nigeria, for instance, which I tell in my book, it also means that the colonial government actually begins to restrict Christian missionary activity among Muslims. Right, northern Nigeria it's a little unique in some ways. In fact, among certain missionaries, like it was often said that, well, it was said that, well, that northern Nigeria is actually the worst place in the world to be a Christian missionary. And so the response to the colonial government was, why are you restricting European Christian missions? This is supposed to be an imperial project. We should be, Christianizing these people. Why do you want to keep them Muslims? Obviously, those like Lugard were described as saying, we don't think that Islam is great, but we just understand that Africans cannot possibly they can't be Christians. They just don't have the capacity to become Christians. Better to leave them as Muslims and just, turn your sights elsewhere, right? And so they were competing imperial projects, if you will. But one of the things that I try to do with this narrative is to understand how, even in spite of those distinctions, once one understands the race-religion authoring that was at the heart of that project, one sees how an aversion to missionary activity and a commitment to evangelization actually cohere. They actually really, those two ideas are perfectly compatible once one understands that project, not merely as racial and not merely as religious. Once one sees that it was, there was a mutual co-constitution of racial and religious authoring that was going on. Therefore, those like Lugard who wanted, who argued that Africans didn't have the capacity to become Christians, the idea was that, well, this hierarchy, right, it's just such that they just can't climb up the ladder. For missionaries, the idea was that, well, Africans are in need of a certain kind of civilization that only European Christianity can provide, right? And so the race, religion, authoring, and hierarchy, and ultimately subordination was central to both ways of seeing certainly Africans, and of course, for sure, Muslims.
My question is, what things that you think can take it to break down this race, religion, hierarchy, and then also fill that protection gap?
That's a great question. One of the things that I found really interesting, when I was invited to do this, to address the state parties negotiation, was it's very unusual that historians are ever called, to these spaces. It's like, is this a setup or something? I think that, the first step is to at least be aware, right? Is to at least be aware that this is not just a question of religion, because that misses it. So that's what the third gets wrong when he says, well, Islamophobia is, it's about double discrimination. And so we have to see race and religion before, we can even see what's going on in Islam. So that there has to be, an understanding that is grounded in history, because it's only once we have that we can even begin to actually, formulate a theory and certainly to imagine what the response would be. So, I would say that's sort of what I'm doing is the minimum, right? What that's going to mean in the end, for how this, moves forward or not, we'll see what actually happens with that. But maybe you guys would do, as policymakers, as international lawyers, will do a lot of work thinking about that. Actually, like legal history, it's a very comfortable space to be. It's like, just looking at the past, but of course, we're not the disciplinary commitment is to not be presentist. You're not supposed to look at the past through the lens of the present. But to play on words and to use to adopt someone's the comments of a foremost legal historian, we are always present-minded, of course, right? We're always present-minded when we look at the past. It's just untrue that we somehow, I somehow travel back in time and I live 2024 and my experiences, right? As a Black Muslim woman, that's just not what it is.
I might just ask a follow-up question, and then I see that there are hands. Thank you. It's funny because what you described, I sort of see, the gaps in the work. I sort of take a religion perspective combined with gender. But in the work of Shirley Rabiat, for example, she takes a race perspective. And I often say, we're sort of getting at the same problem but from different avenues. But maybe that's where our mistake lies. But I'm wondering if you have seen any examples of like a nice linking of race and religion in law anywhere in the world. Can you think of any example that you would say is positive in terms of this linking of the race religion framework, or are we really not quite got there?
Right. That's a great question. What I've been focusing on has been, the international legal context, and I just have not. So I've looked at the jurisprudence of the STIRD, right? The committee that implements I should have looked at the jurisprudence of the UN Human Rights Committee. There's a lot of talk of intersectionality, like, just like, yes, it's great. We've all adopted intersectionality now, but it's not doing the job. And so one finds, for instance, the courts, the Human Rights Committee decision in some of the, so that there's been this line of hate speech cases from in Europe, right? In several, from the Netherlands in particular, in which what happens is that in those cases where the question of, for instance, ethnicity or national origin, which is usually a code word for biology or skin color in these cases, when that's specifically an issue, things get done. But when that's not an issue, right? Even when for some of these cases, I sort of try to imagine, I try to imagine what the background of the, of some of these petitioners are. Like for some of these cases, when you might say, well, this person is, was born in the Netherlands. I'm like, okay, is she white? Is she, what does she look like? But in cases where one does not find, something I can code as skin color, like, again, ethnicity, national origin, you just see that there is, the community just does not see that this is Islamophobia. It has to either be about double discrimination, like we have to see the race, or it's just not. And that, what's going on is also a part of, right, the legacy of that. So it's that delinking, right, that which produces institutional and international law, in which yes, there is there is a robust regimen on religious liberty, but there is no religious anti-discrimination, like or even equality per se. It's freedom of religious liberty, and so that's also doing part of the work. And so one finds that in these cases, if race, not just race, actually somatic phenotypical understandings of race as biology is not, there is no code word for that. Things just don't get done. I think it'll be really interesting to actually, and I wonder if someone is already doing it, to do some anthropological work and actually these claimants whose claims did not come through, like what do they look like? Like, how do they identify? How did that influence how, the court or the committee read them, or their claims. But of course, part of what I also argue is that, this protection gap, it's not just about it's not just that people who are not somatically, Black or brown fall through the cracks. It's also that claims, for instance, for protections of the headscarf by Black and brown women would not be cognizable under this regime. If it's a claim about the headscarf as the headscarf as such, if it's not something else, if you're not sort of linking it to, biology or skin color, it's just not gonna come through.
Hey, I see a couple of other hands. I'll start with Carly.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a question I could even ask you, Professor. And so I guess it goes back to either of you. But do you ever find that, or I guess the question is, have you ever faced animosity or any negative views in what you research? I feel like when you put forth that you're looking up Islamophobia or systemic Islamophobia in Canada, and you're looking at it within the justice system, I can't assume that it's all just smiles and like, yeah, keep going. Like, and I wish it was, because it's such an important thing to research. But I was wondering if you face any backlash and what that backlash looks like in your research. I feel like that question can go to either of you, but
yeah, I mean, for sure there is backlash. Even the term is, it's more, like you can use it with less resistance in certain spaces. Let's put it that way. There's someone would still query whether it's even a legal term. Like you meant, sometimes I even have to explain myself, like, by the way, people, there's debate about whether Islamophobia is Islamophobia or something. So there is, like even with the, not just the research, like even like the terms, the foundational terms, right? Which, it's a question of, like, what can we say? How are we heard? Like, can we even be heard? Like, if we can't even, use the term Islamophobia without explaining ourselves, right? But for sure there is pushback. But I would also like to hear what Professor Bacht.
I think I might defer that to later. I would agree. Absolutely that it can be work that is quite fraught, and absolutely there is resistance to the use of certain terminology, to sort of an empirical database that you might be using. Yes. So the short answer to that is yes. It can be. But so, there are also spaces where there is encouragement.
Right.
So I think both exist.
Right, absolutely. And and we're not where we were even 5 years ago at all. So there is, advancement and improvement.
Another question?
Yeah, so I guess I'm trying to put side by side today's talk and your article, and using intersectionality as a method. We're talking about Islamophobia in the context of this article. And I'm wondering what you think the practical reasons for why we should have a convention that focuses on religion, using race as our method or as our framework. What kind of practical results we would get domestically in Canada. For example, for taking notice of Islamophobia, either in courts or legislation or whatever that might be. And then also in, I guess, like just discursive spaces as well. Yeah, because I think from my understanding of your article is that you thought that we need more intersectionality when we're talking about Blackness and womanhood and Islamophobia. And my understanding from today is that intersectionality maybe is not the best on a global scale or as an international response.
That's a great question, and it actually helps me to because I would, but to think out loud about how I moved from that to writing that piece to then this to this talk, which was just published in late January in in the American Journal of International Law. And and what I would say is what I noted at the end of the talk, that that asking us to adopt a race religion construction of Islamophobia is to ask us to move beyond intersectionality, but it's not to ask us to not continue to draw on the gains of intersectionality theory, right? Because it does, intersectional theory continues to offer a powerful way of understanding the question of intragroup vulnerability. So that will continue to be really important. Oppression is not evenly distributed among Muslims, as I argue, in that chapter. But that analysis can't come first, right? We have to first understand how. So, Islamophobia is not just about religion. It's not just about race. It's about the mutual constitution of both things, and that's really important. I mean, one of the things I usually say is that there is this really simplistic narrative. It's in international law. So the narrative goes like this. It's like, first the world was divided along the lines of religion, and now it's along race, and so that's why race is sort of a thing. But it's just not true, right? To understand who the racial other is to understand that racial other is always at the same time, in international law, a simultaneous religious other, right? That those two things, are mutually co-constituent. What that means in practical terms is that it invites, right, those who are participating in the UN debates to think about this seriously, right? To understand how the invocation of intersectionality on both sides of the debates actually obscures more than it reveals, right? So notice what I pointed out when I laid out the debates. People arguing for this are saying, well, it's about intersectionality. If you only really took intersectionality seriously, we're going to see how intersectionalizing race and religion will help us understand this problem. And those who are opposite us, actually to become intersectional, to adopt an intersectional lens is to realize that adopting this proposal to extend this provision and this convention to religion would be a grave mistake, because it would do serious damage, for instance, to Muslim women, right? And the fact that everyone has been so stuck, right? People in the debate have been so stuck on, most people in the debate have been so stuck, right, on this question of intersectionality actually has made it impossible to understand, right, what's actually going on. The consequence, of course, has also been that even, what I would describe as very well-intended, right, very progressive, attempts to understand Islamophobia, including by the CERT, right, to embrace intersectionality, continues to actually, exclude claims that it ought to take seriously. And so the hope is that by at least, beginning with this, and I want to be really modest about, this is like, let's start by understanding the history and understanding how that history lives on. And that once we do that, once policy makers, once, scholars begin to pay attention to this, hopefully we can actually move to the level of doing the hard work, which is then figuring out how to have this, expressed in law, how this might actually lead in the end to meaningful change.
We probably just have time for one other question, because I think there's another here at Judy.
So you've given us great insight. I'm just curious to know about how does intercommunity racism within the Muslim community affect particularly Black Muslim specifically, and how we can combat that form of discrimination within the Muslim community.
Yeah. Again, a really difficult question. So one of the things that was really hard for me when I wrote the piece, the chapter, in the systemic Islamophobia, because I really felt like I was out of my element, because I'm a legal historian, so I'm like, what am I doing? What am I, it was sort of like speaking out loud, right, from my own experiences. So I definitely think that it's a huge problem, right? Again, to go back to the point that I made earlier, oppression is not distributed equally, for sure. I mean, how to respond to it. I mean, and now I as a legal historian, I usually just say, just understand the history. But now you're like making me to, actually calling on me to speak in the language that in the voice that I adopt in the, in the systemic Islamophobia chapter. I mean, I would say that for sure, one place to start from at least is to listen, right? Is to actually, give voice to experiences. For us, as lawyers and as future, change makers and policymakers, to reconsider what we understand as, what evidence is, what proof is, what we understand, what sorts of articulations of experiences we take seriously. Right, because I mean, legal education trains us in a certain mode, right? To see and hear certain things, but to also exclude certain things. And I think that I hope that at the very minimum, that we can begin to actually be more inclusive, right? In who we see and who we hear, and I hope that that would be at least one small step that can be taken.
Okay, I'm so sorry I have to cut off this really interesting discussion, but I just wanted to thank you so much. Really interesting conversation. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us online as well.